Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. Welcome back to Hausfrau Friday. This is a regular weekly segment on my permaculture channel where we talk about the overlap of domestic skills and philosophy with the pursuit of ecological living. So today I want to talk about, this video may end up being a two-parter, probably will end up being a two-parter. I have been asked a number of times recently, how do you run a business where you put out a YouTube video probably at least 5 times a week, where you unschool your 4 children, where you are a full-time homemaker in charge of all of the domestic obligations of running a household, and also care for an elderly parent? That's a really good question. So I thought today I would unpack a little bit of the philosophy that I have and kind of some of the strategies and tools that I employ to help me get everything done that needs to get done and not feel absolutely haggard in the process. And also be true to myself and who I am as a person. I think that's really important. This is a vocation that I have chosen. It's a vocation I really love. And I needed to work within the parameters of who I am as a person. I need to have authenticity and integrity in my work. And that means that I need to find a way of doing my job that fits my personality and is sustainable for me. Sustainable living is not just how are we interacting with our environment, are we trying to live a way that's ecological, but sustainable living also has to be a pursuit that we can sustain within the context of our real lives and our real selves. So a lot of traditional homemaking books and a lot of homemaking websites and Facebook groups are deeply, and rightly so, deeply concerned with having a schedule, having a rigid schedule, having a organizational structure to your homemaking. And that is very well and good. I know some people need a schedule. When I was a kid and we would go on vacation, my mom would have a schedule and it would be broken down sometimes into 15-minute increments. Like everything was very scheduled. And perhaps that has influenced the fact that I don't like rigid schedules. I don't like rigid institutions. I don't like rigid structure in any way, shape, or form. Probably why I like permaculture, which is loose and site-specific, and you follow guidelines and principles based on the observations you're making about the environment around you and the needs of the system that you're in. It's probably also why I went to Grinnell College, which at the time was a college that didn't have rules. It had self-governance, where you learned to take care of yourself and your own needs and behave in a way that was ethical and authentic. It would be impossible for me to discuss the strategies and the philosophies that I use on a regular basis to run my household, unschool my kids, and run a small business without first discussing how I developed those philosophies and what else has informed them. So we need to back up in time a little bit. I want to say that if you are a homemaker and you are not a parent, I am going to be discussing parenting for a little bit, but that doesn't mean that the things that I'm about to talk about are not relevant to you. Any of us who are homemaker, our homemaking is going to be very site-specific, much like our garden design. And by site-specific here, what I mean is the composition of your household and the needs of the members of your household will drastically shape the way your homemaking looks, right? For me, being a homemaker now with 3 teenagers and an 11-year-old looks way different than when I had 3 small children and was pregnant. Those are very different periods in my life, very different needs for the members of my household. So I need to back up in time a little bit because I've been a homemaker for so long, and because I'm really conscious of the fact that homemaking is not static, the needs of the household are not static, that it's an ever-evolving organic process, so much like a garden, right? There is kind of a logical succession in our gardens when we're starting out amending the soil, feeding the soil, when we're then adding those first very small plantings of perennials and watching them slowly mature and begin to produce fruit. And then we're reaching a part of our food forest design where we are dealing with different chores, pruning, much more harvesting. We're dealing with the maturation and the closing of the canopy, when early on we had very, very different chores, very different needs of our system, our garden system, and very different responsibilities. Parenting is no different. So as I've said, I really don't like institutions. I don't like serving rules for rules' sake. I need any rules that we have to serve the members of my household. I really reject things that are very legalistic. And again, I know a lot of traditional homemaking is very schedule-based. A lot of homeschooling is very schedule-based because a lot of folks find that if they are trying to homeschool their children, they are trying to run a household, that things get forgotten and hours can get whittled away not taking care of obligations. And I understand that. So if you are a very rigid scheduler, this is not a condemnation of you. It's just that that does not work for who I am as a person. And that is not a successful strategy for me. It's because we're all individual people. We all need different kinds of strategies. So maybe the like rigid calendar, the like thick organizer where you write down everything, maybe the like calendar on the wall and post-it notes everywhere, maybe that doesn't work for you. It does not work for me. So maybe my strategies might be helpful for you. So when I was parenting really young children, I am the youngest in my family by a lot. I had very little experience with children, with understanding children. And I was raised with very strict kind of German parenting style that really de-emphasized emotions, de-emphasized emotional literacy, emphasized very much obedience to parents, rules, including rules about media consumption. I was allowed 1 hour of TV a week, had to be PBS. Rules about bedtime, rules about meals. If I didn't finish everything on my plate at dinner, it was served to me at the next meal as cold leftovers, and I had to eat that before I could eat the actual meal that I was looking forward to. I had to eat the yucky leftovers I didn't want. So I grew up in a very rigid household, and I knew that for me, that resulted in a lot of resentment and anger, and I didn't enjoy being raised that way. I felt that my voice didn't matter. I felt that my opinions didn't matter just because I was a small young person. So I knew when I started raising kids that I wanted to do something different. So initially my parenting strategy was, however I was raised as a kid, I'm going to do the opposite. And I'm going to say that like, I knew this thing was really uncomfortable for me. It created a lot of problems for me. I don't really know what to do in this situation. So I'm just going to try and do the opposite of the thing that was terrible for me. And you would not believe how successful that was. Now, I had lots of wonderful mentors, my La Leche League leaders, especially when I was young. I had Ruth at 23. So I was a young parent. I had B at 25. So by the time I'm 25, I have 2 children under 2 years old. And I had to figure out, like, how do young kids work? I read a lot about child development. For me as a homeschooler and a parent and a permaculturist, one of the most successful strategies I have been able to employ is to be able to research on my own and to teach myself things, to be an autodidact, to say, I don't know what the heck I am doing here. I am incredibly ignorant. I'm going to read everything that was written on this subject and I'm going to learn. And I'm going to go talk to people who are skilled in this thing and I'm going to ask them to mentor me. Being able to acquire new skills as the needs present themselves is a crucial part of being a homemaker and a crucial part of being a parent because many of us were raised with a dearth of good parenting skills. So for me, as that cusp of like Gen X, millennial, like transition period, a lot of us had to develop new skills and we also had to heal from our own childhood trauma in order to be better parents. As I began parenting my kids, one of the things that I learned very early on is that rules don't work for us. They don't work for anybody in our household, with a few very small exceptions. And I began to understand that very young children don't actually understand the concept of obedience. And obedience is not really something that I value, despite being in an evangelical community at that time. In fact, one of the things that first started to push me away from the teachings that I was hearing on a weekly basis is that I don't actually believe in obedience. I don't actually think children should offer first-time obedience to parents. I don't think kids shouldn't talk back to their parents. I don't think that kids should be seen and not heard. I think that kids are people and that when we look at children, we interact with children, we're interacting with another human being, and they are not less than because they are younger than us. That's childism, if you think that. One of my big passions is speaking out against childism, which American culture, especially Portland culture, which is fairly anti-child in a lot of ways, despite some really cool clusters of really empathetic parents. Portland culture is fairly anti-child. And so for me, acknowledging the humanity in my kids and checking myself every time I wanted to superimpose authority that I don't rightly have, to superimpose rules and to ask for obedience from my kids. Those were things that I threw away very early on. Realizing for me that connection communication, and working as a team were the way to get things done. And also respect the emotional intelligence of my kids, respect the autonomy of my children, of their bodies, of their wills. That was really, really important. And that has shaped a lot of the way that I run my home now when they are teenagers. So we don't do rules. We don't do punishment at all. And I know that can seem like, oh, we're getting into some really fringe territory here, Angela. But my kids are 19, 17, 14, and 11. They've never been spanked. They've never been grounded. They've never been punished. And they're all lovely human beings and we have a really good relationship. But they also are really outspoken people who know their own mind and can communicate really clearly, and they don't take from anybody. And for me, I really value that. My kids are not kids who are going to be manipulated. They're not going to be abused by authority figures. But dang, that has made parenting really challenging because I have to have a justification and an answer for everything that I ask them to do. Or there's often quite a bit of negotiation. Hey, Hal, I really need you to take out the recycle. The bin is really full and I need you to take it out. And instead of saying, yes, ma'am, and like dropping what he's doing and going and doing it, he'll say, you know what, Mom, I'd like to finish this chapter in my book. I'll take care of it when I finish my chapter. Maybe in another generation or another household, that would be back talking or disobedience. In our household, it's like, that's cool, man. I totally get it. If I'm in the middle of a meaningful activity, I don't want to be told by someone else in my household, you have to stop that right now and do this chore. I want to finish my row of knitting. I'll get to it in just a second. I'll get to that chore in just a second. I want to finish this paragraph that I'm reading. I want to finish, wait till the cookies are out of the oven and then I'll go take care of that chore. Children, it's no different. So there's a lot of negotiation. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of my kids exerting their own will. It might be something like, hey, everybody, here's our chore list. And I need somebody to tackle cleaning the toilets today. And the response might be, B hasn't done the toilets in a long time. Mom, why don't you tell her to do it? And then B will say, well, I don't like cleaning the toilets. How about this, Mom? Would you be willing to do the toilets for everybody in the household if we all take on some chores that you normally do? So it's taught my kids wonderful negotiation skills. And like, why do I need to be so rigid in my thinking? Why can't I just let go? Why do we have rules that can't be renegotiated? Why do we have chores where there isn't flexibility? If everything gets done in the household and everybody is happy about it, then we're successful. So the way that I parent my kids, the way that we don't have rules, we don't have punishment, we focus on connection and cooperation. If one of my kids makes a big mess and they're really ticked off about it and they don't want to clean it up, like they've knocked over a whole bin of Legos. A normal parent might say, like, you can't have dessert until you've cleaned that up. Or no screen time until you've cleaned that up. In our household, we would say something like, that's really frustrating. I hate it when I make a mess and now I have a big cleanup job. Would you like me to help you? And that means for me as a parent, I'm often much more involved. It means that when my kids are sad and angry and ticked off, that they're not left alone, that they're communicated to, that when you have a situation that's hard and frustrating for you, someone can come along and help you. And so please remember that when someone else is struggling emotionally or physically and having a hard time, you can offer to come alongside them. So sometimes I'm really stressed out. I'll be in the kitchen and I'll be like, oh, this kitchen's a big mess. I'm so frustrated. Like I don't have the energy to deal with this. And I'm really ticked off. And you know what? All those years of communicating to my kids, like, oh no, you made a mess. Let's go get the mop. We'll clean up the milk together. It has resulted in teenagers that are like, Mom, why don't you just go take a break in the other room for a minute, put your feet up for a second. And like, I'm going to wipe down the kitchen counters. I'm going to put away all the dishes in the dish drainer and then like check back in with me in 10 minutes. Kids who have been raised with empathy, with connection, with communication, kids who are treated as we want to be treated, grow into teenagers who value connection, who value treating other people the way they would like to be treated. Now, I'm not saying it's always perfect. I'm not saying it's always wonderful. It is incredibly challenging, and I would say it probably takes more emotional energy. So with very young children, it would look like things like B would climb up onto the dining room table and want to stand on it. And she'd be very, very little, too little to be able to get back down safely. So instead of saying, we don't get on the table, you need to get down off the table. Or if you get on the table again, I'm going to put you in timeout we never did timeout. Timeout doesn't work. If B would climb up on the table as a child who was perhaps 18 months old, didn't have the self-control and developmentally didn't have a brain that could understand consequences, couldn't understand rules in that way, the correct solution as a parent would be like, uh-oh, you're on the table again. I'm going to help you down. Pick her up, put her on the floor. Do this over and over and over with saying, our feet stay on the floor. And there might be 100 times of repetition. If the first time she'd gotten on a table, I had spanked the snot out of her and put her on the floor, maybe she would be so traumatized she wouldn't repeat that behavior, and that would look like obedience achieved. But for me, it's more important to have the connection. It's more important to understand that developmentally young kids need tons of repetition to learn things and to be okay with that. Like, that's why I'm a parent and a homemaker. It takes a lot more energy that way, but that is what I signed up for when I chose to make 4 children. So for me, focusing on the fact that parenting my children is about a relationship with my children and not about rules, that it is about connection and not punishment, that it is about raising kids who can think freely for themselves, have a strong sense of self, a strong sense of self-respect and body autonomy, and a strong understanding of who they are as a person and an ability to stand up for their needs and advocate for themselves, instead of having kids who are meek and obedient and do what I want when I want. I am not a dictator. I'm not a tyrant. I am a person living in a house with 5 other people, and we all have to work together. All of that parenting, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. It has been a learning process. And again, I have been able to have folks in our, particularly unschoolers and also connected parents groups, who model that for me when I'm having a particularly challenging time interacting with one of my kids, who can say like, hey, here's what it looks like on the other side of it. Or this is difficult now in the moment, but what you are doing is you are sowing seeds of a really strong relationship, and you're sowing seeds in your kid of teaching them that they have value as a person, that their desires have value, that they will be a stronger and more healthy, functional human being because of the strategies that you're using now. Those words of encouragement have been really, really important for me and really bolstering for me during those times. Because let me tell you, having 4 elementary school, middle school kids all together is really challenging. Having a toddler and at the same time having a preteen and then 2 kids crammed in the middle is really challenging. So this may seem really foreign to those of us who are raised with parents that had a high need for discipline, who are raised in institutional public schools with a high need for discipline and compliance with rules, when we perhaps have had jobs that have a high need of compliance for rules. To live a life where you don't have rules, you don't have punishment, you talk out your problems, you learn to communicate compassionately and with empathy, you learn to communicate your feelings and your needs without weaponizing them, you learn to communicate directly instead of passive aggressively. Doing all of that feels very counterculture. It feels very strange to those of us who weren't raised that way. It's not how most people parent children in the US. Most people in the US also don't practice permaculture and don't unschool their kids. So I realize this might seem a little strange, but for me, it feels like the most sustainable way, the most healthy way. And as a permaculturist, somebody who's looking for strategies to building resilient systems, to building a better way of living that has earth care and people care in it, that way of parenting has worked incredibly well for our family and has helped me be true to myself and my philosophies. So let me give you one more example, and then I'm going to wrap up here and I'll be back for part 2, where I talk about how I use this mindset of my parenting to actually run a household and run it really well in a way that doesn't stress me out most of the time, in a way that works for our whole family and helps create a positive and peaceful home atmosphere, and at the same time get the work done that we need to get done. So let me leave you with one example. When my 3rd kid was a little bit younger, he loved to do Legos and loved to do Legos all over the living room floor. And as I've said in other videos, we have a pretty small house. So that wasn't always great for us, but to him, his process of building, his creative process of designing with his Legos meant that he needed to have things spread out on the floor. And then the finished Legos had to all sit in a neat little row where nobody would touch them or break them. And for me, like, this didn't always work. Like, this is the room where we have company. This is a communal family space that we all share. And it feels to me, Hal, like you are dominating the space in a way that doesn't give other people fair access to it. And normally a parent might be like, okay, all these Legos have been on the floor for 5 days. I'm really tired. I need to vacuum. I'm tired of this mess. I'm tired of stepping on Legos. You have until the end of the day to clean up your Legos, or I'm going to go around with a trash bag and I'm going to pick up all the Legos and put them in the trash bag and then make some threat about throwing them away, or make some threat about like, I'm going to put them on a high shelf. And when you have done X number of chores, you will have earned back your Legos, but don't ever leave them all over the living room floor again. That's how a lot of parenting books run. They run on threats. They run on transactionality. They run on a punitive way of thinking. I want to run on an abundance way of thinking, a connected way of thinking. So here's how this conversation went. We had to have it multiple times over the course of a couple of years because he was really into Legos and this happened repeatedly. Again, my goal is not to have a perfect looking living room. It's to have a good connection with my child and to help raise healthy, whole children. So it'll go like this. Hey, Hal, I see that you're really involved in your Lego process. I see this is really important to you right now, but we need to have a talk about it because nobody else has access to the room. And I also need to get some cleaning done in here. I don't want to have to vacuum up your Legos and then pick them out of the vacuum. I know you don't want to do that either. What solution can we come to so that your Legos are better contained? I can keep the living room clean and we can have this be a common space we all share. And then we would just brainstorm. So there's no threats. He doesn't need to get angry or defensive because there's no fear of punishment. And I'm asking him to create solutions. I'm asking the child to come up with a solution that works for him and then bounce it off me and perhaps other people needing to use the living room. And talk about like, does this work for everybody? And then he would say like, okay, so here's my proposal. My proposal is, I don't want to move my stuff and you guys just deal. And then I would come back and say, so that's not going to work. Try again. And he would say, okay, well, how about I have 2 more days of mess on the floor and then I'll clean up and you can vacuum. And I might counter offer with something like, how about this? You can have 2 more days of mess on the floor and maybe at the end, like you want to help me clean up the living room because now it's dustier and dirtier than it would have been if I'd stayed on my normal cleaning routine. And he'll say like, okay, sure, I am fine with vacuuming, but you know I hate dusting. I don't like the feel of the dust cloth. And so I'd say like, okay, let's do that. So we're going to just like make a little note, put it on the wall and say, Hal gets 2 more days. On Friday, we're going to clean up the Legos and we're going to move them to another space in the house. And then the 2 of us are going to clean the living room together. The end. No conflict, no broken relationship with my child. I have to deal with a small amount of discomfort of 2 more days of a messy living room, which in the context of my life, like that's pretty small. My child has to deal with the fact that he doesn't get to own and dominate the living room forever. So he also feels a little bit of discomfort. But we negotiate and we come to a compromise. We both learn to feel uncomfortable and that that's not the end of the world if we don't 100% get our own way. He learns that other people have to share the space and that he can creatively come up with solutions, that we can work together to find a solution to a conflict or a disagreement in which everybody feels pretty good about it at the end. And we don't need to fight. There doesn't need to be fighting. We don't need to have broken relationships in order to deal with things that frustrate certain members of the household. So I'm not the perfect parent. I do make mistakes. I do sometimes fall back into patterns from how I was raised. I have a tendency, when I'm really stressed, I think a lot of us as parents can have this, where our childhood trauma can bubble up and what we fall back into are those patterns that are so deeply ingrained in us from childhood, and we have to constantly work against it to find another way. So I'm happy to talk about parenting philosophy. I'm happy to talk about how my permaculture and my other experiences in life, perhaps going to a somewhat hippie college, perhaps these sort of deprogramming and deconstructing I've done, both from sort of really stringent institutionalized religion and also from the way that I was parented, how healing from those things has helped me become a better parent. It's made me a better permaculturist. It's made me a better person. It's made me a more effective homemaker. And it's helped me have a really strong and robust relationship with my children that I feel really good about. So I'm happy to talk about those things more if you all have questions. if you are interested in that at all, please drop questions down below and maybe I'll make a follow-up video. But for now, stay tuned, and I'm gonna have a part 2 video uploaded a little bit later today. It might be tomorrow morning, depends on what YouTube is doing, where I talk about how this parenting philosophy has informed very much the way that I run a household effectively, strategically, but not legalistically. So tune back in for that real soon. Thanks for watching.